One sentence, scribbled in ink, would set the world ablaze. The thought was as distant from Count Leopold von Berchtold's mind as the moon from the earth. His world was the small, oppressive sphere of his study in the Ballhausplatz, a room thick with the scent of melting beeswax and old paper. A single candle threw long, dancing shadows across the ornate desk, its flame guttering in the draught that whispered through the grand but aging windows of the Viennese palace. Outside, the city of 1914 slept, or tried to, under a blanket of uneasy summer humidity. Inside, the Count was engaged in the delicate art of statecraft, his pen scratching across a heavy sheet of official parchment. He was drafting a letter to the Serbian government, a document intended to be a final, firm, but ultimately peaceful resolution to the simmering tensions that had gripped the Balkans. The recent assassination of the Archduke had left a raw, bleeding wound in the Austro-Hungarian psyche, and the pressure from his allies, particularly the hawks in the military and the German embassy, was a constant, throbbing presence in the room. They wanted blood. He sought a path that would preserve the empire's dignity without plunging it into the abyss. His task was to walk a razor's edge between strength and provocation. The candlelight gleamed on the gold band of his signet ring as his hand moved, forming elegant, looping script. He wrote of sovereignty, of the need for cooperation, of the grave consequences of harboring terrorist elements. The words were measured, the tone that of a stern but reasonable patriarch. Yet, as he reached the letter's pivotal paragraph, a wave of fatigue and external pressure washed over him. The whispered urgings of the German ambassador, the impatient glare of General Conrad, they coalesced into a moment of fatal ambiguity. His pen hovered, then dipped, and he wrote a phrase that seemed innocuous, a standard piece of diplomatic language. Should Serbia fail to comply fully with the empire's demands, Austria-Hungary would be compelled to take necessary measures to ensure its security. He did not ponder the words. To him, they were a placeholder, a vague assertion of authority that could be interpreted as anything from further economic sanctions to a breaking of diplomatic ties. He was a man trying to calm a storm, not realizing he was adding gunpowder to the air. He sanded the page, the granules catching the light like tiny, fallen stars, and blew the excess away. The phrase sat there, embedded in the text, a dormant seed of catastrophe. He sealed the letter with a dollop of red wax, pressing his ring into it, forever imprinting the von Berchtold crest upon a sentence that would echo through history. He leaned back, the weight of the late hour settling on his shoulders, believing his work was done for the peace of Europe. He had no inkling that he had just penned the first, quiet spark. A single, sealed envelope, no larger than a man's hand, could feel heavier than a block of granite when it contained the fate of empires. That weight settled deep into the soul of France, the young courier tasked with its delivery, as he stepped from the hushed, marble halls of the Ballhausplatz out into the vibrant, chaotic life of a Vienna morning. The sun, still low and gentle, painted the grand Baroque facades in shades of gold, but France carried a chill that had nothing to do with the shade. The envelope, tucked securely inside his weatherproof leather satchel, seemed to pulse against his chest with a life of its own, a tiny, malevolent heart beating in time with his own. He moved through the city's arteries, a solitary figure in a uniform of deep green, weaving through a Vienna that was blissfully unaware of the poisoned dart moving among them. The air was thick with the scent of fresh bread from the Hofbäckerei and the rich aroma of coffee from crowded Kaffeehäusers. Laughter spilled from open windows, and the clatter of horse-drawn trams and the calls of newspaper boys created a symphony of mundane life. France's mind, however, was not on the city's music, but on the quiet farmhouse on the outskirts of Graz, where his mother would be kneading dough and his younger sisters would be chasing chickens in the yard. He thought of their faces, their simple hopes, and felt the satchel's weight intensify. He was not just carrying a letter. He was carrying the fragile membrane that separated their world from one of unimaginable chaos. He quickened his pace, his boots clicking a rapid, anxious rhythm on the cobblestones. The sky, which had been a clear, innocent blue, began to betray him. A bank of bruised, purple clouds gathered with startling speed over the spire of the Stephansdom, and a cold wind snaked through the streets, whipping dust and discarded handbills into frantic spirals. The first drops were fat and heavy, smacking against the cobbles like warning shots. Within moments, the heavens tore open, releasing a torrential summer downpour that turned the world into a gray, roaring blur. People shrieked and scrambled for cover under awnings and in shop doorways. France, his uniform instantly soaked and clinging to his skin, hunched his shoulders over his precious satchel. He slipped on the slick stones, his feet skidding, and his heart seized in pure, undiluted terror. The satchel flap flew open. For a horrifying second, the cream-colored envelope, bearing the official seal of the foreign ministry, was exposed to the deluge. It teetered on the edge of the bag, a paper boat about to be launched into a raging river. It was a perfect, terrible metaphor, the fragile document of peace, threatened not by armies or declarations, but by a simple, indifferent rainstorm. With a desperate, lunging grab, his fingers closed around the envelope just as a gust of wind tried to pluck it away. He clutched it to his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the ink of Count von Berchtold's fateful phrase already beginning to blur and run slightly at the edges from the few drops that had struck it. He found shelter in a recessed doorway, his body trembling not from the cold, but from the sheer, gut-wrenching proximity of disaster. He carefully blotted the envelope with his dry inner tunic, his movements tender, as if tending to a wound. The crisis was averted, the letter saved, its journey to Belgrade able to continue. But the incident left a profound unease in its wake. The peace of Europe, he realized with a sickening clarity, was no more substantial than a piece of paper in a rainstorm, and he was the one desperately trying to keep it dry. The paper felt like a shard of ice in King Peter I's hand, a coldness that seeped past his skin and into the marrow of his bones. He stood by the tall window of his study in the royal compound, the letter from Vienna held in a grip that was dangerously tight. Outside, the city of Belgrade sprawled under the afternoon sun, a tapestry of red-tiled roofs and the lazy curl of smoke from countless hearths. It was a scene of ordinary peace, but the king saw only the ghosts of past conflicts rising from the dust of the streets, their whispers drowning out the present calm. The Austro-Hungarian seal, a stark crimson blot on the cream parchment, seemed to pulse with a malevolent life of its own. His eyes, old and weary from a lifetime of exile and struggle, scanned the text once more, snagging on the phrase as if it were a barbed hook. Necessary measures. The words echoed in the silent room, transforming from diplomatic filler into a dire, unmistakable threat. He did not see the measured tone of the rest of the letter, the appeals to reason and sovereignty. He saw only those two words, and in them he saw the glint of bayonets and heard the thunder of howitzers, memories of past humiliations at the hands of the Habsburgs flooding back with the force of a broken dam. This was not a letter. It was a prelude to an invasion, couched in the polite language of diplomats but carrying the iron taste of war. He turned from the window, his movements stiff with a rising panic he could no longer contain. With a sharp, jerking motion of his hand, he summoned a servant, his voice a gravelly command that brooked no delay. Within minutes, the heavy oak table in his council chamber was surrounded by his most trusted and most volatile advisors. The air in the room grew thick with the scent of old brandy, nervous sweat, and the faint, acrid odor of gun oil from the military men. He tossed the letter onto the polished wood, where it landed with a soft, damning slap. He did not merely present the document. He framed it with his own deep-seated paranoia, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and nationalistic fervor. He spoke not of the letter Count von Berchtold had written, but of the letter he believed had been sent, an ultimatum disguised as diplomacy, a gauntlet thrown down before the proud Serbian nation. He pointed a trembling finger at the phrase, his words painting vivid pictures of Austrian divisions massing on the Drina River, of the vast, hungry empire once again seeking to grind his small, defiant kingdom into dust. The room, once a place of reasoned debate, swiftly became an echo chamber of alarm. The younger, more militant officers nodded, their faces hard, their hands clenching into fists. They saw the king's fear and mirrored it, amplifying it with their own thirst for righteous defiance. The subtle art of diplomatic nuance was the first casualty in that room, trampled under the boot heels of pride and the terrifying specter of a past they were determined not to relive. The path to calamity was being paved not with malicious intent, but with a king's fear, a fear that blinded him to every possibility except the one he dreaded most. A single, reasoned voice in a chorus of alarm is often the first to be drowned out. For Serbian diplomat Jovanovic, the frantic energy emanating from the king's council chamber felt like a physical force, a hot wind pushing against him as he moved through the palace corridors with a determined, though heavy, heart. He had read the Austrian letter, and where King Peter and the hardliners saw a veiled declaration of war, Jovanovic, a man seasoned in the subtle language of European courts, detected something else, a troubling ambiguity, a door left slightly ajar for interpretation and perhaps for de-escalation. The phrase necessary measures was reckless, certainly, but in the lexicon of diplomacy, it was not necessarily a synonym for mobilization. It was a thread, frayed and fragile, but a thread nonetheless, and he believed it was his duty to pull on it before the tapestry of peace unraveled completely. His first move was to draft a carefully worded request for clarification, a message intended for his counterpart in the Austrian embassy. He chose his language with the precision of a watchmaker, crafting sentences designed to soothe rather than provoke, to ask rather than accuse. He emphasized Serbia's desire for a peaceful resolution and humbly requested an elaboration on the specific nature of these measures, hoping to expose the phrase as the diplomatic placeholder he suspected it to be. But the machinery of the Serbian state, now gripped by war fever, had become a swamp of intentional delay. His dispatch was passed from one junior official to another, each one eyeing him with a mixture of pity and suspicion. He was a moderate, and in times of rising tension, moderation is often mistaken for cowardice or, worse, treason. The hardliners, their influence swelling in the paranoid atmosphere the king had cultivated, saw his efforts not as prudence but as a dangerous hesitation that could be perceived as weakness. They did not want clarification. They wanted preparation for a fight they now believed was inevitable. Hours bled away in the antechambers of power, each tick of the grand clock in the hall marking another grain of sand lost. Jovanovic paced, his polished shoes wearing a path on the ornate rug. His requests for an urgent meeting with the Austrian envoy met with noncommittal murmurs and bureaucratic shrugs. The very system he served was conspiring against his mission of peace, its cogs gummed up by fear and nationalist fervor. Meanwhile, across the city, the Austrian envoy, a pragmatic man named von Bauer, waited in his own office. He had received vague, unsettling reports from the Serbian palace and had himself sensed the sudden chill in their official communications. He had cleared his afternoon, expecting a visit, a note, some form of contact from the Serbian side to address the brewing storm. He waited as the light outside his window softened from afternoon gold to evening gray, the silence from the palace growing more ominous with each passing minute. The missed connection was not born of malice, but of the simple, crushing weight of human error and institutional inertia. A junior clerk, overwhelmed by the flood of panicked memoranda, misfiled the note confirming Jovanovic's requested appointment time. A guardsman, given vague instructions, turned the diplomat away at a palace gate he was supposed to use, forcing a long, frustrating detour. By the time Jovanovic finally extricated himself from the labyrinth of his own government's making, the hour was late. He arrived at the Austrian embassy, his coat clutched tightly around him, only to see the windows of von Bauer's office dark. The envoy, having waited in vain, had departed for the day, believing the Serbs had chosen silence as their answer. Jovanovic stood on the empty street, the chill of the night seeping into his bones. The opportunity for a quiet, rational conversation had evaporated, lost not in a grand confrontation, but in the small, cumulative failures of a system under stress. The misunderstanding, now hardened by hours of silence and assumption, deepened into a chasm that one man, no matter how reasonable, could no longer bridge. The whisper from the Balkans, distorted and amplified by the frantic tapping of telegraph keys, arrived in St. Petersburg as a roar. It slithered through the gilded halls of the Winter Palace, a serpent of alarm coiling around the gilded pillars and silk-draped walls, until it found its way to the ear of the Tsar of all the Russias. Nicholas II stood in his private study, a room that was a testament to the immense, sprawling power he wielded, yet he felt that power as a brittle, fragile thing. The decoded message lay on his desk, a stark summary of the Austrian letter to Serbia and King Peter's panicked, belligerent response. His eyes, the pale, troubled blue of a winter sky, fixed upon the translated phrase, "necessary measures." To the Tsar, those words were not an ambiguity to be pondered. They were a gauntlet thrown down, not just to a small Slavic kingdom, but to the entire Slavic world he saw himself as sworn to protect. The pressure was immediate and immense, a physical weight, settling upon his slight shoulders. It came from two directions, merging into a single, compelling force. First, the ghost of his alliance with France, the intricate web of treaties that bound the fate of his empire to that of a republic across the continent. To hesitate, his foreign minister murmured, would be to appear weak, to risk fracturing the very alliance that checked German ambition. Second, and more potent, was the whisper of personal ambition and dynastic pride. The Romanovs were the guardians of orthodoxy and the Slavic peoples. To stand idly by while a fellow Slavic monarch was threatened by the Austro-Hungarian eagle would be an unthinkable abdication of his sacred role. The phrase "necessary measures" became, in his mind, a direct challenge to his own autocracy, a test of his nerve on the world stage. He gave the order, his voice quiet but firm, and the great, slumbering beast of the Russian Empire began to stir. The tension that had been a distant rumble in the Balkans now became a palpable, physical reality in the military districts of the West. In the vast, muddy training grounds outside Warsaw and Kiev, the order for preparatory measures sent a jolt through the ranks. Regimental commanders, their faces a mixture of grim determination and uneasy foreboding, pored over maps lit by kerosene lamps, their fingers tracing the vulnerable borders with Germany and Austria-Hungary. The air, once filled with the routine sounds of drill and hoofbeats, now thrummed with a new, urgent energy. Storehouses, long and low-slung like sleeping dragons, were thrown open, revealing stacks of rifles that gleamed with a dull, deadly sheen in the twilight. Artillery pieces, shrouded in canvas, were uncocooned, their long barrels pointing westward like accusing fingers. In the officers' mess, over glasses of vodka that did little to warm the chill in the air, the debate raged. Older, grizzled generals, their beards gray with the dust of the Russo-Japanese War, argued for caution. They spoke of the logistical nightmare of a full mobilization, of the vast, unprotected plains that an enemy could exploit, of the sheer, unimaginable scale of a continental war. They were the voices of experience, of remembered defeat, but they were shouted down by younger colonels, their chests ablaze with medals and a burning, impatient patriotism. They saw not risk, but destiny. They spoke of Russia's holy duty, of her immense, limitless manpower, of a swift, decisive strike to humble the Habsburgs and secure their place in history. The Tsar, isolated in his palace, received only the echoes of this debate, and the loudest echoes were always the most bellicose. The cautious whispers were lost, drowned out by the drumbeat of ambition and obligation. With every train car loaded with troops, every telegraph wire humming with coded orders, the interpretation of two ambiguous words solidified into an irreversible reality, and the echoes in the east began to shape the storm to come. A single, decoded telegram, carried on the ether from the heart of the dual monarchy, landed on the Kaiser's desk in the news palais like a lit fuse. Wilhelm II, the supreme warlord, did not merely read the summary of the Austrian letter to Serbia and the ensuing panic. He consumed it, his mind a forge where facts were hammered into the shape of his own grand design. The phrase "necessary measures," which had sown such varied interpretations, ignited in him not caution, but a fierce, uncomplicated blaze of pride. He saw not a diplomatic blunder, but a righteous challenge to the established order, a glorious opportunity for the German Empire to prove the steel of its loyalty and the might of its arm. The complex tapestry of European alliances was, in his mind, reduced to a simple, chivalric drama, and he was the knight-errant riding to the aid of his beleaguered Habsburg cousin. He erupted from his chair, the telegram clutched in his hand, his famous mustache bristling with martial energy. He paced the length of his opulent study, a room crowded with the trophies of power, model battleships, portraits of armored ancestors, maps of the world with German colonies marked in bold, possessive red. The news from Vienna was not a crisis to be managed. It was a trumpet call to destiny. The thought of appearing hesitant, of allowing the Slavs and their Russian patrons to doubt Germany's resolve, was anathema to him. It struck at the very core of his self-image, a carefully constructed persona of decisive, unstoppable force. In a moment of pure, unadulterated impulse, he turned to his startled aides, his voice ringing with absolute conviction. He pledged Germany's full and unconditional support to Austria-Hungary. The famous blank check was not a carefully negotiated document. It was a sovereign's impulsive promise, scrawled across the moment with the ink of his own immense pride. The air in the room, once still and formal, crackled with the sudden release of immense energy. Aides and senior military men, men like the more cautious Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg, felt the floor shift beneath their feet. One, a gray-haired adjutant whose career had spanned the cautious statecraft of Bismarck, dared to voice a quiet objection. He spoke of the risks of escalation, of the delicate balance that had preserved the peace for decades, of the need to seek clarification, to leave a door open for the Russians to back down with their honor intact. He was a voice of reason, a whisper of restraint in a gathering storm. But the Kaiser's pride was a fortress, and caution was a key that no longer fit its lock. He waved the objection aside with an impatient, almost contemptuous flick of his gloved hand. He misjudged the Russian character, believing the Tsar would ultimately flinch from a confrontation with the superior German army. He misjudged the intricate chain of alliances, seeing them as bilateral agreements rather than a continent-wide powder keg. Most fatally, he misjudged the momentum his own words had just unleashed. His pledge, sent flashing down the wires to Vienna, was not a tool of diplomacy. It was a weapon. It transformed Austrian resolve from a tentative probe into an unshakable certainty. Ignoring the pale, worried faces of his advisers, he turned his attention to the maps on the wall, his finger stabbing towards the east. The order was given. Across Germany, in barracks and stables and railway yards, the first, irrevocable steps of mobilization began, not with the roar of cannon, but with the quiet, terrifying efficiency of a machine whose gears, once set in motion by a single, prideful decision, could no longer be stopped. The blank check from Berlin, a promise of unconditional support, arrived in Vienna not as a document of state, but as a shot of pure adrenaline into the heart of the Austro-Hungarian government. The cautious hesitation that had once lingered in the corridors of the Ballhausplatz evaporated, replaced by a hard, glittering certainty. Count von Berchtold, who had once penned an ambiguous phrase in a moment of weary pressure, now found himself the architect of a document with no room for ambiguity at all. The misinterpreted letter, the king's paranoia, the diplomat's failed mission, the Tsar's mobilization, the Kaiser's pride, all these threads, spun from a single sentence, were now woven into a noose. The ultimatum to Serbia would be its final, tightening knot. Drafted in a climate of emboldened fury, the document was a masterpiece of diplomatic brutality. It was not a request but a list of 10 unconditional demands, each one a deliberate, calculated assault on Serbian sovereignty. It demanded the suppression of all anti-Austrian propaganda, the dissolution of nationalist societies, and the dismissal of army officers and officials deemed hostile by Vienna. Most humiliating of all, it insisted that Austro-Hungarian officials be allowed to participate directly on Serbian soil in the investigation of the Archduke's assassination. It was a demand for surrender, not negotiation. The 48-hour deadline attached to it was not a window for discussion, but a ticking clock counting down to the inevitable. The phrase "necessary measures" had been given its grim, explicit definition: total compliance or total war. Across the chancelleries of Europe, the text of the ultimatum sparked a frantic, last-ditch scramble. In London, Paris, and even Rome, seasoned diplomats stared at the pages in disbelief, their experienced eyes seeing the continent's fragile peace being deliberately shattered before them. Coded telegrams flew back and forth, desperate appeals for moderation, for an extension of the deadline, for any crack in the wall of Austrian resolve now buttressed by German steel. But the wall held firm. Vienna, drunk on the confidence Berlin had provided, was immovable. The diplomats, for all their skill and frantic effort, were like men trying to hold back a tidal wave with bare hands. Their pleas for reason were met with cold, formal acknowledgments, their proposed compromises dismissed without consideration. The machinery of war had already been engaged. Diplomacy was now just a ghost haunting its gears. The final, futile act of this diplomatic tragedy played out in a tense, airless meeting room in Vienna. The Serbian reply, a masterpiece of desperate statesmanship that acceded to almost all of the demands while skillfully resisting direct Austrian oversight of its judiciary, was presented. It was a document that, in any other time, might have been the foundation for a settlement. But the time for settlements had passed. The Austrian envoy who received it did not read it for its nuances or its concessions. His instructions were clear, his mind already made up. He scanned the pages not for a path to peace, but for the single, specific point of refusal. Finding it, he looked up, his face a mask of cold finality. He declared the Serbian response unsatisfactory. The word hung in the room, small and dry, yet it carried the weight of millions of future graves. With a curt, formal nod, he gathered his papers and stood. No more words were exchanged. The door closed behind him with a soft, definitive click, a sound that echoed not just in the room but across a continent. The path to war, paved with pride, fear, and a single misinterpreted phrase, was now sealed. The final, fragile hope was extinguished, leaving only the gathering darkness. The contagion of war, once a distant political abstraction, now seeped into the very soil of Europe, a fever burning in the earth itself. It traveled not through the air, but along the humming telegraph wires and the freshly laid railway tracks that crisscrossed the continent like veins carrying a poisoned blood. From the grand capitals where kings and kaisers had sealed the fate of millions, the fever spread to the smallest villages, the quiet farmsteads, the humble homes where life had been measured in seasons and sunsets, not in marching orders and artillery barrages. In a small, sun-drenched village in the Rhineland, the fever found its way to the doorstep of a carpenter named Karl, a man whose world had, until that moment, been defined by the grain of wood and the love of his family. The official notice, a stark, printed form with a smudged imperial eagle at its header, had been delivered by a boy on a bicycle, his face pale and serious. It was not a request but a summoning. Karl stood in the doorway of his workshop, the scent of fresh-cut pine still clinging to his clothes, the paper trembling in his rough, calloused hand. The words mobilization and report immediately seemed to blur and swim before his eyes. The political miscalculations in Vienna, the pride in Berlin, the fear in Belgrade, all of it collapsed into this single, personal cataclysm. He was no longer a carpenter, a husband, a father. He was a soldier, a number, a piece to be moved on a vast, bloody board by men whose faces he would never see. That evening, the house was filled with a silence more deafening than any noise. The simple wooden table, which had borne so many meals of laughter and quiet conversation, now held only the grim weight of the unspoken. His wife, Anna, moved through the motions of preparing a final supper, her hands fluttering like trapped birds, her eyes red-rimmed and avoiding his. She sliced bread with a terrifying slowness, as if each cut were a measurement of the time they had left. Their two young children, a boy and a girl, sat unnaturally still, sensing the tectonic shift in their world but unable to comprehend its cause. The boy, Friedrich, clutched a small, whittled toy soldier Karl had made for him, his small fingers tracing the shape of the rifle. The irony was a physical pain in Karl's chest. Later, in the small bedroom under the eaves, Karl packed his kit. The process was surreal, a ritual of mundane preparation for an unimaginable reality. He folded a spare uniform, its coarse, gray wool unfamiliar against his skin. He placed a photograph of his family in a tin box, a tiny, fragile shield against the chaos to come. Anna stood watching him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as if holding herself together. There were no grand speeches, no promises of glorious return. There was only the crushing, intimate truth of a life being torn in two. He reached out and took her hand, his carpenter's grip firm around her trembling fingers. The touch was a language of 10 years of marriage, of shared sunrises and whispered fears, and it said everything that words could not. It spoke of a love that feared the future, of a goodbye that felt like an amputation. At dawn, he stood at the door, his kit bag slung over his shoulder, casting a long, distorted shadow in the low light. He kissed his sleeping children, their faces peaceful and trusting in their ignorance, and the taste of the kiss was like ashes. He turned to Anna one last time, her face a pale, beautiful mask of grief in the gray light. Then he stepped out into the cool morning air and joined the stream of other men from the village, a river of gray flowing towards the railway station. He did not look back. He knew the image of his family in the doorway would be a ghost that would haunt him forever, a flickering candle in the overwhelming darkness that lay ahead. His personal story, a tiny, heartbreaking echo of millions of others, was now irrevocably swept into the great, grinding machine of a conflict born not of his making, but of the pride and miscalculations of men in distant, candle-lit rooms. The mobilization fever had taken him, and the world he knew was gone. The first official declaration of war arrived not with the roar of cannon fire, but with the frantic, staccato chatter of a telegraph machine in a dusty Viennese office. The sound was a metallic death rattle for the age of peace, a coded message tapped out in the lonely hours of the night, its meaning as stark and final as a guillotine's blade. The operator, a pale young man with ink-stained fingers, transcribed the words with a growing numbness, the letters forming on the slip of paper like a verdict. Austria-Hungary declared a state of war to exist with the Kingdom of Serbia. He stared at the message, the mundane surroundings of the telegraph office, the humming banks of machinery, the coiled wires, the smell of ozone and dust, suddenly feeling like a tomb. He was the first to know, the first to hold the physical proof that the continent had just taken its first, irrevocable step into the abyss. His hand trembled as he placed the slip into the pneumatic tube, sending it whisking away to the foreign ministry, a tiny coffin carrying the old world to its grave. The news, once released, propagated like a virus through the nervous system of Europe. Telegraph offices from St. Petersburg to Paris became the epicenters of a new, terrible reality. They were no longer quiet rooms of clerks and codebooks. They transformed into chaotic, sweat-soaked arenas of panic. Messengers, their faces etched with a mixture of self-importance and dread, burst from the doors, clutching sheaves of paper that felt hot to the touch. They sprinted through streets that were only just beginning to stir, their pounding footsteps a dissonant drumbeat against the familiar morning sounds of shop shutters being raised and milk carts rattling over cobblestones. The air, once clear, now seemed thick with the electricity of impending cataclysm. One such messenger, a boy of no more than 16 with a cap pulled low over his brow, skidded to a halt in a large public square in Berlin. A crowd had already begun to gather, drawn by the unspoken tension that had been thickening the air for days. They were a mosaic of the city, shopkeepers in aprons, students with books under their arms, mothers with children clinging to their skirts, old men who had seen other wars and whose faces were already closing like fists. The boy, breathless, scrambled onto the base of a bronze statue of a forgotten general. He unfurled the official communiqué, his voice, which had not yet finished changing, cracking as he shouted the words that formalized the nightmare. He declared that the German Empire, in response to Russian mobilization, was now at war with the Tsar. A profound, unnatural silence fell over the square for a single, suspended second, as if the city itself had taken a sharp, indrawn breath. Then the silence shattered. It was not a unified roar of patriotic fervor, but a fractured cacophony of human reaction. A group of young men, their eyes alight with a dangerous, romantic fire, cheered and threw their hats in the air, already seeing themselves as heroes in a grand adventure. But their shouts were drowned out by a woman's piercing, raw scream, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror that cut through the noise like a physical wound. An old man sank to his knees on the cobblestones, his hands covering his face, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. A mother clutched her toddler so tightly the child began to cry, the small, confused wails a counterpoint to the rising tide of chaos. The crowd surged and fragmented, becoming a sea of individual horrors, faces contorted by fear, by excitement, by a dawning, gut-wrenching comprehension of what these abstract declarations truly meant. The war was no longer a story in the newspapers, a debate in Parliament, or a phrase in a diplomat's letter. It was here in this square on this morning, delivered by a breathless boy. It was in the tears on an old man's cheeks and the terrified grip of a mother's hand. The first declarations had been made, and in their wake, they left not order, but a continent-wide scream of anguish, poised on the edge of a darkness deeper than anyone could possibly imagine. The silence that fell over Europe was not one of peace, but of exhaustion, a great, weary sigh after a decade of screaming metal and dying men. The battlefields, once churned into vast, liquid graveyards of mud and blood, slowly began to heal. Grass, stubborn and green, crept over the shell craters that pocked the land like the pockmarks of some terrible disease. Wild poppies, a brilliant and ironic scarlet, bloomed in thick clusters where so much crimson had been spilled, their delicate petals trembling in the same winds that had once carried the stench of cordite and decay. But the healing was only skin deep. Beneath the new verdure lay the bones of a generation, the shattered husks of artillery shells, and the deep, psychic scars that would never truly fade. The empires that had marched so proudly to war in 1914 lay in ruins, their gilded eagles toppled, their crowns melted down, their sprawling territories fractured into a patchwork of nervous new nations. The world that had existed before the war was not just changed, it was erased, existing only in the fading memories of those who had survived its obliteration. One such survivor was Karl. He had returned to his village in the Rhineland, but the man who came back was a ghost of the carpenter who had left. His workshop stood as he had left it, the tools waiting on their pegs, the scent of pine now layered with dust and neglect. His hands, which had once shaped wood with such gentle precision, now trembled with a constant, faint tremor. They were still capable hands, but the knowledge they held had changed. They knew the weight of a rifle, the feel of a bayonet sinking into something soft, the desperate grip on the edge of a trench as the world exploded around him. His wife, Anna, welcomed him with a love that was fierce and protective, but it was a love that had to navigate the minefield of his silence. He could not speak of the things he had seen, the friends he had watched turn to crimson mist, the years spent living like an animal in the earth. The children, now nearly grown, regarded him with a respectful, fearful distance. The father who had kissed them goodbye was a stranger who jumped at the sound of a slamming door, whose eyes sometimes stared through them into some private, hellish middle distance. On a quiet afternoon, many years after the armistice, Karl sat in a patch of sunlight by the window, a thick historical volume open on his lap. He was trying to understand, to trace the thread of causality from his small, shattered life back to its source. The book detailed the July crisis, the diplomatic blunders, the fatal chain of events. His finger, calloused and scarred, traced the lines of text until he found it, a reproduction of Count von Berchtold's original letter to Serbia. His eyes moved over the formal diplomatic language, and then they stopped. There it was, the phrase, necessary measures. 2 words so bland, so bureaucratically innocuous on the page. He read the analysis that followed, how it had been misread in Belgrade as a threat, how it had been interpreted in St. Petersburg as a challenge, how it had been embraced in Berlin as a call to arms. A cold, profound emptiness opened inside him. He looked up from the book, his gaze drifting out the window to where his son, Friedrich, now a young man, was chopping wood with an easy, powerful rhythm. This was the legacy. Not just his own trembling hands and haunted nights, but a world forever scarred, a continent bankrupt in spirit and treasure, and millions of stories like his own, cut short or irrevocably broken. It had all spun out from this. From a single, ambiguous phrase, scribbled in a moment of haste and pressure in a candle-lit room 1,000 miles away. It was not the work of a cartoonish villain, but of fallible men, men blinded by pride, crippled by fear, trapped by alliances, and defeated by simple miscommunication. The weight of it was incomprehensible, the sheer, grotesque disproportion between